Creamer Media's Mining Weekly is interviewing Ed Stirk, the Director of Research of the World Platinum Investment Council. We're speaking to Ed about the latest edition of Platinum Quarterly, which presents fourth quarter and annual platinum supply and demand developments for 2022, as well as an updated outlook for 2023. The latest Platinum Quarterly is forecasting a platinum deficit of 556,000 ounces in 2023, which, let's remind ourselves, is this year. What is driving this expected deficit, Ed?
Well, Martin, thank you, and thank you for having me on again to talk about our outlook. The main driver really for the deficit projected for this year is a combination of very muted growth in supply, principally due to the power challenges facing South Africa, as well as some of the sanctions against Russia, which are creating operating challenges there, in combination with an extremely robust outlook in terms of growth. So supply in aggregate, mining plus recycling supplies, is only expected to grow by around 3%, whereas we're projecting demand growth of 24% year on year, which is particularly strong.
And the Platinum Quarterly reports that investment demand will improve by more than 900,000 ounces this year. On what is that improved investment forecast based?
Well, it's a combination of things. So partially it's because we saw net disinvestment in 2022, and that was on what was actually pretty robust bar and coin demand, partially offset or more than offset by ETF disinvestment. So we saw in total from the middle of 2021 to late 2022, almost 900,000 ounces of platinum come out of the platinum ETFs globally. And we also saw some significant exchange stock outflows of almost 500,000 ounces over that same time period. So total disinvestment from financial assets of getting on for 1.5 million ounces. Now, it's important to just unpack that a little bit and try and understand what was driving the disinvestment. Well, in terms of ETFs, it's partially macro asset allocation decisions. ETFs are a non-yielding asset. We've seen rising real interest rates, and so there's been a hunt for yield amongst investors, which ETFs don't really supply, and so that's been a factor behind some of that disinvestment. But added to that, the platinum markets, the platinum forward and futures markets were in backwardation for much of that time period. So if you are an asset class agnostic investor, admittedly most investors aren't asset class agnostic, but if you do have that flexibility, then you can move your platinum exposure from the ETF, where you're typically paying 0.5% a year for that ETF exposure, into the forwards and futures market, where because of the mechanics around it being in backwardation, you're effectively being paid to hold that position. So that was also probably a factor behind the ETF disposals. In terms of the exchange stocks, that's largely a function of the platinum market having the platinum yield having been at pretty elevated levels throughout most of the time period we're talking about. And so again, rather than holding platinum on exchange, where you're not attracting any income on those platinum holdings, you can move them off exchange and potentially lend out those platinum ounces and benefit from the high yield rates. So that that was behind the exchange stock outflows. Looking into 2023, the platinum market is back in contango. If you look at the economic outlook, we do see continued real interest rate rises, but at a slowing pace, and then possibly reversing later this year. And in terms of the exchange stock outflows, yield rates have fallen somewhat, but they do still remain elevated. But fundamentally, and possibly more importantly, in terms of the minimum levels that exchange stocks can reach, they're back to their pre-COVID average historical levels. And for the ongoing functioning of the exchanges, it seems unlikely that they can be allowed to fall too much further. So coming back to the question of the 1.3 million ounce swing in investment ounces between 22 and 23, a big factor is we think that the ETF disposals are likely to be significantly reduced. Exchange stock outflows pretty much run their course. And at the same time, we're expecting strong bar and coin demand of around 450,000 ounces for 2023. So a big improvement in net investment numbers.
And then moving to automotive, it seems that you're forecasting a lift in automotive demand of about 10% this year. and this is going to be increased because of platinum substituting palladium and also expected higher loadings. And how much palladium substitution is expected, and what is the latest on emissions legislation and higher platinum loadings?
So it is a big important driver. So I'd argue that the platinum substitution for palladium in gasoline vehicles is a bigger factor in the outlook for platinum demand from the automotive industry in 2023 than vehicle production numbers. So in terms of the level of substitution we're talking about for this year, it's moving up from around 440,000 ounces last year to almost 550,000 ounces in 2023. So quite a big increase in terms of the substitution numbers. And as I said, that's primarily in gasoline vehicles. You've also got higher loadings. That's largely in the heavy duty segment, and it's due to the final implementation of the China 6 legislation in China, obviously. So those are the big driving factors. In terms of vehicle production numbers for internal combustion engines, we're actually expecting a small decrease in internal combustion engine production year on year. So the increase in platinum demand is really on those substitutions and higher loadings. If we look further ahead, beyond just this year, that platinum substitution for palladium trend is expected to continue, so long as there's that ongoing price differential between platinum and palladium. There's an economic incentive there for the automakers to continue to make that switch. And remember that this substitution is occurring on new models. So as new models are developed, it's pretty easy to make changes to the balance between the different PGMs in the exhaust treatment system. Once that new model is launched, it's typically locked in for the 7-year life of that model. So any substitution that's occurring now is going to be a factor for a number of years to come. In terms of the emissions standards and what we can expect in the future, there's a lot of talk around Euro 7 coming in at some point later this decade and what that might mean in terms of higher PGM requirements for the exhaust treatment systems. That's still being kind of worked out. There's certainly a fair amount of opposition that's been publicly spoken about in the press to bringing some of those measures in. And the European Commission has also left itself scope to manoeuvre on that. And indeed even the ability to postpone implementation of those tighter emission standards or to soften them.
Industrial demand this year is set to increase, Platinum Quarterly says, by 12% year on year, almost matching its strongest year on record. What are the main drivers of industrial demand, and is this level of demand sustainable in your view?
That's a good question. Industrial demand is a little bit different to the other sort of end demand segments in that whilst there is ongoing consumption of platinum, there's a lot of internal recycling. So the sort of the year-to-year incremental demand requirements are typically pretty small in an ongoing operation. So simply replacing the losses that occur during the manufacturing process of the various different products that use platinum in their manufacturing methodologies. So the big drivers on a year-to-year basis in terms of platinum demand are capacity additions. So that's when a new plant is constructed, it is populated with the platinum required in order to operate, and then on an ongoing basis, it's only really the losses that are replaced. So the big drivers are capacity additions, and it just happens that in 2023, we're expecting some fairly substantial capacity additions, in particular in the glass sector. So the last strongest year on record was 2021. And again, the high demand in 2021 was driven by glass capacity additions. We saw much fewer of those in 2022, and that resulted in a fairly significant decline in industrial demand for platinum last year. But again, we're seeing more of those come through in 2023. And so, as you said, we're approaching the second strongest year on record, very close to being the strongest year on record. How likely is that to happen? Well, remember, these are large capital projects. So they're substantially already committed to, in many regards, probably already substantially complete from a construction perspective, and certainly well advanced in their platinum procurement. So in the near term, we'd say that the industrial demand outlook is pretty well locked in. Now, it's worth bearing in mind, of course, we do have a fair degree of economic uncertainty in the world at the moment. How is that going to manifest in terms of the impact on platinum demand in the future? Well, for industrial demand, we think the near-term risks are pretty low because so much of that demand is already committed to. But if we do see a long sustained period of economic uncertainty or recession, then in terms of industrial demand, the impact will be felt probably 2 to 3 years out. But as things stand at the moment, I think most economic commentators would say we're kind of possibly beginning to get out of the woods, although the chances of recession haven't dropped to zero by any stretch of the imagination. They've certainly pulled back from the very high levels that were expected earlier this year in terms of recessionary risks.
And looking at platinum jewelry, as COVID restrictions ease in China, what is on the cards for platinum jewelry?
So we've got a fairly significant year-on-year increase of around 15% in terms of platinum jewelry demand in China in 2023. That's off a base in 2022 that was quite heavily impacted by both COVID restrictions and then by the end of COVID restrictions. So it is a reasonably good increase, but it still remains well below long-run historical demand levels in China, which has typically been the most important market globally for platinum jewelry demand. I think thinking about the medium to longer term outlook for jewelry demand, platinum jewelry demand in China, we've seen a fairly steady trend over a number of years of it gradually ebbing away due to competition with other segments, other luxury good items, and I think without a sustained improvement in terms of the consumer tastes for platinum there, the best we can probably expect is a stabilizing of the outlook, and that would be our base case forecast at this point in time.
Massive imports of platinum into China have been observed since 2021. What should be read into China's decision to ensure that it has a good supply of platinum?
So it's really interesting. I mean, as you said, there have been substantial imports into China, well in excess of identified demand. So that's resulted in effectively an accumulation of above ground inventory in China. And when you look at what's happened on a global basis, that above ground inventory in China has all been sourced from the West. So we've effectively seen platinum inventory or platinum above ground stocks move from the West and into China. Now, China has some pretty rigid export controls for strategic minerals, which includes the platinum group metals. So once that metal is in China, it's very difficult to bring it out again. So if we do see the deficit that we're forecasting for this year come to fruition, it's going to be felt more deeply in the West than it would be in China, where they have accumulated these strategic reserves. What's been the driving force behind that accumulation? Well, it's hard to know for certain, but we can theorize. So one possible aspect to it could be that real demand in China has been higher than we've been able to identify. For the last few years, obviously, travel into China has been somewhat limited or very, very difficult indeed due to the COVID restrictions. And so it's quite possible that there has been some real end consumption that we've not been able to see. But equally, it could also be that demand expectations in China for the future are much higher than we're currently projecting. Arguably, that might be most likely linked to the hydrogen economy in the future. And so China could be, and the operators of hydrogen projects or planned operators of hydrogen projects in China could be looking to accumulate platinum in advance of that. The other more prosaic answer, of course, could simply be that existing users of platinum in China, so the industrial or automotive users, are looking at the outlook, which is one for a deficit this year, and they might be expecting deficits for 2024 and beyond. And they're simply saying to themselves, well, I know that I'm going to need platinum. I can buy it now relatively cheaply, and I can keep it for my needs in the future. And I know that I'm going to be well protected if we do see deficits come to fruition, and that being reflected in market prices.
As demand for hydrogen becomes meaningful, could platinum become a proxy for investors looking for exposure to hydrogen?
Yes, look, I think that's certainly possible. And the reason that I say that is there aren't really many other, or in fact, there are no other commodities that I can think of that are direct contributors to the production of hydrogen, where it could become such a meaningful source of end demand for that commodity that they become intimately linked. So if we look a long way ahead now, we're talking about a hydrogen economy that's growing off an extremely small base today. So we're really talking about going into the latter part of this decade or into the 2030s. By around the middle of the next decade, it's quite possible in our projections that hydrogen demand for platinum could equal automotive demand today, for example. And exactly when in the 2030s that happens depends upon the pace of fuel cell electric vehicle uptake. But at that point, or even in the approach to that point, in a market that's looking tight, where the marginal source of end demand is coming from the hydrogen economy, that's sort of where prices are being set, then you could argue that platinum makes an excellent proxy for hydrogen. Remember that investors can't invest in hydrogen as a commodity directly. There aren't really any opportunities to do that today, so they have to invest in proxies, either in the equities for the companies associated with the hydrogen industry, or in the future, arguably platinum could fulfill that role, where hydrogen demand for platinum becomes meaningful enough that it becomes a price setting mechanism for, or part of the price setting equation for platinum, and therefore ebbs and flows in the demand or the production of green hydrogen become key in terms of price setting for platinum, and the proxy status is established.
That was Creamer Media's Mining Weekly, speaking to Ed Stirk, the Director of Research of the World Platinum Investment Council.